I'm really here to talk about cycling today rather than business. And I want to talk about a cycle club that I'm involved in called the Tombland Cycling Collective. And we are more of a collective rather than a club, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And I want to really talk about how this kind of accidental cycling club came around, and I'm going to do that in a couple of ways. And first of all, I'm going to tell you my story, how I got to this cycling club, having been a competitive sports person for, well, ever since my early teens, and how I've left the competitive side of sport behind for a different approach to sport and leisure and activity, and all the reasons for that. I mentioned before that, I'm a competitive cyclist, or was a competitive cyclist, and before that I was a competitive rower. So for me, if I look back at my teens and throughout my 20s, cycling and rowing and other sports that I did were always firmly competitive. It wasn't for me a collaborative environment, and it wasn't a particularly supportive environment. And that was how I viewed sport, and I think to some extent that's how I viewed the world. And at that point, although I had a loosely fitting, low resolution view of mental health and stress and anxiety and depression, as I got older and my life became more stressful and I was running a business, it started to creep up on me that my own mental health was suffering at that point. Of course, at the time I didn't recognise it. Those coping mechanisms were largely riding my bike harder and harder, but they were also drinking more and more. And my background at that time, in 2014, when my son was 3 months old, we were on holiday in the Alps. I'd taken a break from work at a very stressful time, and as we'd gone to the Alps, my boy who was born premature, fell very ill. He contracted a virus. He was asthmatic, and as we know now, we weren't so clear on that then. We were at altitude and we were overseas with pretty poor parochial village medical services at our disposal. So after those had failed and his health continued to fail, we went to the local hospital, and within about 20 minutes of seeing one of the specialists at the hospital, I was asked that dreaded question of, what's your medical insurance like? Which is something no parent ever wants to hear. And I said, well, why are you asking? And they said, well, do you have good medical insurance, international medical insurance? At this point, my anxiety levels are starting to climb. I said, why? They said, well, Hôpital des Enfants in Geneva is the best children's hospital. If you're okay with that, we can get a helicopter and get him there in the next 30 minutes. So, unfortunately, there were no helicopters available in July in the French Alps because the Tour de France was operating and all the helicopters were already in the sky following the likes of Chris Froome around. So, short of a helicopter, they sent an ambulance and some outriders, and off went my wife and my son. And I didn't see either of them really, apart from half an hour here and there for the next 2 weeks. My son went into an intensive care unit, was completely unresponsive for 10 days of those 14 days, during which I was told there was a very, very good chance he wouldn't recover. And if he did recover, he could well be brain damaged. Now, before you worry too much, the story ended well. He did make a full recovery. But as I'm sure you can imagine, being stuck in a French village with virtually no phone signal, with relay coming back from a hospital in Switzerland in second and third languages, it was a horribly stressful period. I went back to work in the UK in the August, everything seemed fine at the time, and it was about 3 months later when all of a sudden I couldn't function. I woke up one day, I didn't really wake up that day. My complete neurological and psychological system just completely stopped. And I didn't have the support mechanism, the language, any understanding of what was going on at all. I had no frame of reference. I went to see my local GP, who was very supportive, and he told me that I think what's wrong with you is emotional. I think it could be stress, it could be depression, it could be chronic fatigue. Well, for me, that was, well, there's absolutely no way this is emotional. This has to be physical. I have to have an illness. So of course I spent probably the next 2 months with Dr. Google, and believe me, I had everything. I knew I was going to die, I knew I was finished. But eventually, after one test or another, the medical services, both public and private, convinced me that actually there was nothing physical with me, or at least the things that were wrong with me physically were a manifestation of the fact that I was absolutely exhausted. Take it back to cycling. What am I going to do about this? I know that sport and leisure are a way to move forward. I know that this can make me healthier, but it's sure as hell not going to make me healthier if I go back to that dysfunctional zero-sum game of win at all costs, because that was part of the problem, not part of the solution. So for me, it became an opportunity to rescope and retool my view of sport and my view of leisure. And that's really how the Tombland Cycling Collective came around. And we started to gather a few guys who just wanted to cycle comfortably with a little bit of sport, with a little bit of focus. And very early on in that process, what we all learned was that we were quite comfortable talking about our own mental and physical health and our well-being. We never set this out as our agenda. This was never kind of like a rule of engagement that we would be a men's or anybody's mental health cycling group. It just became part of our DNA as a group. And the incredible thing was, as soon as people started talking about it, immediately everybody else in the group said, "Oh, I'm really relieved you're talking about that. I'm so pleased to hear that. Those experiences that you've had, I've had too. I was signed off from work for 3 months. I was ill for 2 months. I had a whole year where I couldn't function." These were people that we'd known for a long time. These were people that had bottled this up because they didn't have the language, they didn't have the comfort, they didn't have the support to talk to bring these subjects up with people that they knew very, very well. And so just by normalising it, just by using the language, and sometimes it's using the language that I think perhaps men are more comfortable with, drifting away from perhaps the very medical language. So we would talk about mental health in the same way we talk about our physical health, in the same way that it might take us a long time to recover from a broken arm or ligament damage. We talk about it in that way. We've had more members. It's always been something that's been central to us. It's always been something we've been really comfortable with. We've never had to work hard to bring mental health as part of the narrative of our club. We've never had to crowbar it in. We've never had to manipulate the environment. It's just been there. People will talk about it directly when they want to, indirectly when they want to, and they'll steer clear of it when they don't feel like talking about it. It's not something you have to control. And we always had another sort of secondary rule that we'd always go as slow as the most hungover person. The idea being that basically you don't have to feel like Chris Froome to rock up on our ride. You'll always be welcome, and we'll always look after you. And I would encourage anybody else who's got associated clubs to do exactly the same thing, because the outcomes are only positive. Thank you.